increasing the money supply causes inflation, and then the next sentence out of your mouth is inflation is defined as the increase in the money supply. You're saying, well, increasing the money supply increases the money supply.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It makes the conversation completely meaningless to use that as a definition of inflation.
Percent of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system.
True.
Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1, that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This.
How many times do we have to go over this, Nima? It depends on productive capacity and unemployment.
Yeah, it depends on a whole array of factors. I mean, prices can go up. So for non-monetary, so he's going to now start talking about how the real inflation is just a supply of money. So he's redefining the term inflation, which is an increase in aggregate prices, to now mean that it's just the money supply rising equals inflation. So now he's made everything he's saying right by declaration, by definition, but it's not very helpful. Also, by the way, there has been research done on the causality of all of this. For example, in Weimar Germany, when the country's productive capacity was destroyed by the French moving in on the east and extracting all the coal, and also the country having to pay off this giant foreign debt, which basically extracts resources from the country. It's impossible foreign debt to other countries. So you reduce the country's productive capacity. Yeah, that'll cause some hyperinflation. But forget the exact researcher who suggested this. I can dig it up, I guess. But it does make sense that when prices go up, everything becomes more expensive. Now the government also has to print more money in order to be able to purchase these things. So it's possible that the causality is actually inverse. The prices go up, and then more money has to be created in order to pay for these prices, and the money supply rises because of supply side shocks that have caused price to go up. By the way, we also saw in 2022 big inflation started as a result of the sanctions on Russia and the disruptions in the global availability of oil and natural gas, which was basically self-imposed restriction, and thus prices for oil went up big time, and that caused high inflation, especially in countries that can't produce their own oil, such as Germany. They had like 9% inflation. I think the US had a 7% inflation in 2022.
And which is, of course, on the tail end of COVID, where everything got shut down for no stupid reason.
Another factor. In COVID, it was a huge amount of stupidity in the supply chain, shutting things down, making people wear a mask because of a cough, or if the business was even allowed to operate, a lot of them had to shut down for a while out of arbitrary.
So that's shutting down productive capacity.
Productive capacity. So yeah, these things definitely caused some inflation at that time.
And then before I click play again, I do want to emphasize this. It drives me absolutely bonkers when someone defines inflation as the increase in the money supply. I mean, like you said, you're just making something equal to itself. 1 is equal to 1. Yes, we know. If you say increasing the money supply causes inflation, and then the next sentence out of your mouth is inflation is defined as the increase in the money supply, you're saying, well, increasing the money supply increases the money supply.
Right.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
It makes the conversation completely meaningless to use that as a definition of inflation.
For sure.
Is where inflation comes from. The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is responsible for most of the...
I'll find it again. But there is the one variable system that you're talking about, right? The only reason that prices could ever go up is because you've increased the money supply, unlike the list of things that we just said.
Right.
The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs, and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers.
Why is that bad?
That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed.
And if the government decrees it, then that's fine.
And there is nothing else. But if you thought that was crazy, get ready to enter the twilight zone of modern economics. We work for some of that currency supply. True wealth is your time, but we trade away moments of our lives, hour by hour, day by day, and year by year, for numbers that somebody printed on pieces of paper or just typed into a computer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can get into a philosophical discussion that, taxation is theft no matter what system that you're looking at. But
what does he do? Does he not earn money? I don't know.
Okay,
does he not sell his gold for money or whatever? I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that's actually a good point. If your gold's so valuable and it's worth so, and it's like better than money, why are you selling it?
Now those numbers represent our blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talent. We are what gives the currency its value. But here comes the really cruel joke. We work hard so that we can save some of that currency, so that we can pay the tax collector. In the United States, it's known as the IRS. They then turn it over to the Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal plus interest on that bond that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it.
Again, it's like half true.
Yeah.
And then the Federal Reserve turns around and gives that profit back to the Treasury. Okay.
Exactly.
Now let's do a recap on this section, because this is where the system begins to rob you and I on a massive scale.
We have a question.
Much of our taxes are not used.
What's that?
We have a question. Would you say money printing isn't inflationary? It's spending money combined with a gap in production to meet demand. Would that sound a way to explain it to the average person? Yeah, I think that's
what it is optimally.
I think that's
right.
A fine
you
way.
Could print too much money, for sure.
Yeah, it's possible to do too much of it. But yeah, he makes a good point. You can print a bunch of money and bury it in your backyard. It's not going to be inflation, right? So the spending money is crucial. Has to be spending operation, and that also ties in with QE, for example. QE is not inflationary because it's just a private sector asset swap between, like we explained earlier, savings account money and checking account money. Yeah, Peter Schiff, why are you accepting dollars going to zero in exchange for? Yeah, exactly, Peter Schiff.
Yeah, well, and then why is the gold always measured in dollars? Why aren't the dollars measured in gold?
Why don't they measure gold in gold?
Because it's all fiat. It's all by decree.
Used for schools, roads, and public services, but to pay interest on bonds that the Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud.
Again, that's not what the Federal Reserve does. It's got numbers on this column and numbers on that column, and it just moves the numbers back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with the statement that there's no justification, I guess, for the government to pay interest on their bonds. There's no need for that. I say thank you very much because they pay me risk-free money.
And Nima's got a bunch of bonds. Yeah.
But
so he gets to benefit from it.
There's no practical, moral, political, economic, whatever justification for doing it. It's almost, it's a handout to people who buy bonds, I guess. Yeah.
But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax.
There still isn't a need for a personal income tax. Nah.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence?
Whether it was a coincidence or not, the government doesn't need our income tax.
Yep.
Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. Yes, this system has owners. Who they are is an even bigger secret that we'll get.
Oh, Nemo is my favorite part. He's getting to my favorite part. The system has owners. Yeah, okay.
To shortly.
Secret.
But first, we need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. There was interest due on that bond, and there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet.
But you didn't borrow it into it. I mean, from the banking system, it got borrowed into existence, but from the federal government, it just got spent into existence.
Right.
But you promised to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest. Where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest.
What's that, Nemo?
Basically, all money in circulation is either came from a bank loan, or from deficit spending, or from current account surplus. But yeah, I mean, it's true. It's not nothing nefarious or strange about that. But he's trying to make it look like it is.
As well. So now
Well, it's all predicated on the idea that we have to work to pay it back. If that were true, for example, if we used euros in the United States and the United States didn't have control over its own money supply, this might actually be closer to truth, right?
Yeah.
But we don't. We live in a country that creates its own money supply.
Yeah, so there it is. For example, if we look at the European Union and its economic problems, there are some things that attain more relevance in the debate over there that are not really relevant over here, because we are a sovereign money issuer, but the individual European countries are not.
Now there are $2 in existence, but you owe 4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. What would happen if the government stopped borrowing to do deficit spending? Are the payments on those treasury bonds going to stop? What would happen if the public stopped borrowing and going deeper into debt? Are your house and car payments going to stop? No. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop.
Again, he's partially right with the banking system. But with the federal government money is what makes up the difference. The federal government can inject the private sector net savings to say, okay, there's enough non-debt money in the system to cover those interest payments, because in the banking system, that's true. And maybe we can criticize the banking system for this, and maybe there's a better way to do this. But, the bank lends out $100 at, 7% interest now, and over 30 years that turns into $200 that needs to be paid back. Yeah, there's more debt out there than, or interest plus principal, than there is principal out there to pay for it. And that's why when we see the U.S. government, whenever it tries to balance the budget or to get rid of the national debt or whatever, and it contracts that non-debt money supply, the private sector only has the ability to go to the private sector for money, and that increases the what's the word I want?
Private
It's
debt?
escaping me.
Yes, it increases private indebtedness to the banking system.
Here's the word I want. It gets to the point where the private sector cannot service its own debt.
That is when a debt crisis occurs, which is true. But the cause of it is austerity measures by the government, a lack of net private savings injected. Also, what he's saying, so he's painting this bleak picture of just debt on debt and debt, more debt and interest. But what he's not presenting is the asset side of the equation, that there's assets that are used to generate profits that service that debt.
Right.
That's kind of important to point out. Now, of course, if the debt goes up and up, you don't have more real stuff, more machinery, computers, training, factories, engineers produced as a result, then that's a problem, but that's not necessarily a given. And generally speaking, that's not the default situation in a capitalist economy. The idea is for the real stuff, the real assets, to be utilized to service part of that debt.
Real quick, Charles Grip is asking, why does the government bother issuing bonds at all? And
Yeah,
then,
good
Charles,
question.
we went into pretty big detail on that earlier, and for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to catch the recording for that answer.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's really no
Yeah.
justification for it. Is the short answer.
Yes.
If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments.
Well, just once again, if we don't go deeper in debt every year, but that only applies if you look at the debt number as an absolute figure. So if by going deeper into debt, you mean the number goes up of the absolute debt, then yeah, we have to go deeper in debt. But what's more relevant is what's the debt to income ratio, right? What is the income that's available to service that debt? Yeah, if that were to drop, if that were to go up and up and up in the economy, that is when debt crises happen. When there's too much debt to income, then that's a problem. By the way, that's not the problem we have in the US right now. The debt leverage has actually been very low ever since around 2014 or so, when it started leveling out. 2009, it was very high. It was like 300% or so, I think. And as part of the housing crisis, that there was a huge period of deleveraging, and it's sort of leveled out at somewhere 230% or so. And we've been staying there for I want to say for probably 12 years or so now. So generally speaking, I would say the private sector is actually not dangerously over leveraged in this country right now.
Charles has another good question here, Neiman. I think you're the best to answer it. Is deficit spending done through issuing bonds?
It's accompanied by issuing bonds, but generally speaking, it just happens via the Treasury writing checks and injecting reserves into the private sector. And then because they have this belief that deficit spending has to be funded by bonds, they issue bonds after the fact and sell those bonds to the people, or offer the bonds to the cash holders in the private sector, because there's excess reserves in the private sector who can go and chase those bonds. And the banking system is most of deficit spending done through issuing bonds. Yeah, I mean
they're two different processes.
They're reconstructing it that
they're
way.
linked, but they're not, and they act like they're linked.
Yeah, they reconstruct it in parallel. Basically, they spend money out of a magic account, the Treasury General account, where that's always replenished to about $5 billion or so, I think. And they sell bonds after the fact. There's a whole ridiculous process that we've actually gone through with Warren Mosler at one point in one episode, which at the end of the day, it comes down to, if you consolidate the balance sheets, the federal government spends money by writing checks to the workers, to the suppliers, and that money ends up increasing the reserves in the private sector. So we have a reserve glut, and then the Federal Reserve sells bonds on the as part of their open market operations to meet the desired interest rate in order to keep it from coming down to zero. And where do they get those bonds? Well, Treasury issues the bonds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they do it in a way that it looks like it's linked, but it's not.
Yeah.
They're totally arbitrary, and they're acting like they're linked.
Well, also, like I said earlier, when we run into the debt ceiling, they actually stop issuing bonds, but they still spend money. So yeah, there's that. It's actually possible to spend money without issuing bonds.
If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.